Act 1. The geometry of a shadow. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only inside limestone. It is not the absence of sound, but rather its preservation. In the rural backcountry of Kentucky, far beneath the overgrown ridges and the forgotten family plots of the 19th century homesteads, the earth becomes a porous labyrinth. Millions of years of mildly acidic rainwater have eaten away at the Mississippian rock, leaving behind an underworld of vaulted chambers, vertical shafts, and crawl spaces so narrow they require a person to exhale completely just to squeeze their ribcage through the dark. Most of these spaces are mapped by local spelunkers or designated as state parks, but some are erased from the topography entirely. If you were to drive down State Route 80 in an unmarked vehicle, past the rusting tobacco barns and the dense thickets of black walnut trees, you might notice an unpaved access road blocked by a heavy steel gate. The sign reads, U.S. Geological Survey Subsurface Hydrology Station, Restricted Access. To the casual observer, it is an unremarkable compound, a prefabricated steel building, a gravel parking lot, and a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It looks like bureaucracy at its most mundane. But beneath the concrete slab of that building is a vertical shaft dropped 60 meters straight into the limestone. This is Foundation Outpost-92, and it was constructed for a single, terrifying purpose: to seal the mouth of SCP-4087, colloquially known within the deeper research logs as the Echoing Hollow. The cave system itself is massive, extending approximately 4.3 kilometers into the deep subterranean strata. By all geological metrics, it shouldn't exist in this configuration. The air down here doesn't circulate like a normal cave. It remains entirely stagnant, cold, and heavy, with the scent of wet iron and petrichor. The walls are not dry rock. They weep a slick, dark moisture that never seems to pool on the floor, instead vanishing into invisible fissures beneath the stone. For the researchers and security personnel stationed at the outpost, life is dictated by a strict protocol of spatial isolation. The containment procedures are unambiguous. Entry into SCP-4087 requires written authorization from at least 2 Level 3 personnel. No living anomalous entity may be brought within 500 meters of the cave entrance under any circumstances. The reason for this extreme caution isn't that the cave is unstable. It isn't that it harbors some predatory beast or toxic gas. The danger of SCP-4087 is far more insidious. It is an environmental pathogen directed not at your health, but at your uniqueness. It is a place that rejects the fundamental concept of the individual. To understand the nature of the Echoing Hollow, one must trace the path of the original survey teams who breached the cavern before the concrete was poured and the security airlocks were pressurized. Descending into SCP-4087 is an exercise in psychological degradation. The upper tunnels are wide, cathedral-like spaces filled with massive stalactites that look like teeth frozen in a permanent, silent scream. But as you progress deeper, past the 1-kilometer mark, past the 2-kilometer mark, the architecture of the earth begins to change. The rough, water-carved limestone transitions into something impossibly smooth. The jagged edges vanish, replaced by undulating, polished stone that looks almost organic, like the interior of an incredibly ancient, calcified throat. The deeper you go, the more the acoustic properties of the cavern warp. In a standard cave, a vocalization produces a clean, decaying echo that bounces off the walls until it loses energy. In SCP-4087, the echo doesn't decay normally. It changes timbre. A cough sounds like a raspy whisper by the third bounce. A footstep sounds like someone else walking a fraction of a second behind you, their boots dragging through the dirt just out of the periphery of your headlamp. At the deepest explored point of the system, 4,300 meters beneath the surface, the tunnels open up into a final, monolithic chamber. The survey teams designated it the reflection chamber. It is a room devoid of natural beauty. There are no delicate rock formations here, no glistening mineral deposits. The chamber is perfectly circular, its ceiling lost in a towering dome of black stone that absorbs the light of high-intensity halogen lanterns as if it were swallowing the photons whole. And in the center of this room lies the heart of the anomaly. A pool, 12 meters in diameter, filled with an unholy pitch-black liquid. The substance within the pool has been analyzed via remote sampling, though the results have raised more questions than they answered. It possesses a viscosity slightly higher than water, but it is completely non-Newtonian in its behavioral response to kinetic energy. It does not reflect light like water does. It absorbs 99.8% of all visible spectrums, yet if you stand over it with a light source, you will see a reflection that is sharper, more vivid, and infinitely more detailed than any silvered glass mirror could ever provide. It doesn't just show your face. It shows the dust motes on your collar. It shows the subtle twitch of your iris. It shows the small, hidden imperfections you've spent a lifetime ignoring in your own reflection. And then the ripples begin. The anomaly of SCP-4087 does not activate through touch alone. It is an observational and spatial trap. When a complex organism, an anomalous object, or a sentient entity enters the perimeter of the reflection chamber, the black pool responds. Even if the subject remains perfectly still, yards away from the edge, the surface of the liquid begins to chew itself into motion. It starts as a single, central distortion, a tiny ring that expands outward until it strikes the limestone boundary of the pool. Then come the secondary ripples, crisscrossing each other in chaotic interference patterns that resemble a liquid frequency analyzer trying to tune into a distant, broken signal. This is the incubation period. It is entirely unpredictable, lasting anywhere from 30 seconds to a grueling 4 hours. During this time, the chamber becomes freezing cold. The air pressure drops drastically, causing the ears of anyone present to pop with a sickening click. The ambient sound of the cave, the distant dripping, the hum of equipment, is completely snuffed out, replaced by a low, subaudible vibration that causes the teeth to ache and the stomach to turn with a sense of profound, instinctual dread. And then, somewhere within the vast network of tunnels you just walked through, a passage opens. It is never a tunnel that was recorded on the survey maps. It is always a crack in the rock that wasn't there 10 minutes prior, a dark, wet fissure that smells of old earth and stagnant water. And from that fissure, something steps out. The Foundation designates these duplicates as SCP-4087-1. The instance is, by every physical metric available to modern science and anomalous diagnostics, an exact duplicate of the target that stood before the pool. If the target was a human being, the duplicate possesses the same DNA, the same dental records, the same old surgical scars, the same microscopic fungal colonies on their skin, and the exact same clothes, right down to the frayed threads on their jacket or the serial numbers stamped onto their equipment. But the replication goes far deeper than the physical vessel. The Foundation's neurological and psychological profiling teams have confirmed that these instances possess an absolute mirror of the original's internal world. They have the same memories of their first bicycle ride. They have the same secret shames, the same political biases, the same fondness for a specific brand of tobacco, and the exact same love for their children. They are not clones grown in a vat. They are a copy-paste error in the source code of reality. But there is a flaw in the code, a horrifying systemic error that ensures no two versions can ever coexist. The moment a duplicate identifies its original counterpart, all rationality, all civilized conditioning, and all self-preservation mechanisms evaporate. They are seized by an absolute, unyielding, and homicidal obsession. They do not wish to negotiate. They do not wish to share a life. They want to tear the original apart with their bare hands. Act 2, the first echoes. The Foundation did not discover SCP-4087 through deep space scanning or anomalous tracking arrays. They found it because a small rural community in Kentucky began to tear itself apart at the seams. According to recovered municipal records dated October 14, 1991, a trio of experienced local cave explorers, Marcus Vance, David Lee, and Sarah Gentry, set out to explore an undocumented sinkhole entry on private timber land. They were well equipped, carried proper subterranean gear, and left a detailed itinerary with family members. They expected to spend 14 hours underground mapping a new extension of the local karst system. They did not return on schedule. 36 hours after their descent, local authorities organized a search and rescue operation. But before the volunteer fire department could even deploy their ropes at the sinkhole entrance, Marcus Vance walked out of the woods. He was covered in mud, shivering violently from hypothermia, and completely non-communicative. He was taken to the county hospital, where he was treated for exposure and severe lacerations to his forearms. 2 hours later, a second search team located Marcus Vance. Not in the woods. They found him 3 miles away, sitting in his own living room, drinking a cup of coffee with his wife. He claimed he had abandoned the dive early due to an equipment failure and had been home for hours. The local sheriff, a man named Donald Vance, who happened to be Marcus's second cousin, assumed it was a bizarre case of identity theft or an incredibly twisted prank. He took the Marcus Vance from the living room down to the hospital to confront the Marcus Vance in the emergency room. It was a mistake that would necessitate the immediate deployment of Mobile Task Force Alpha 4, the headhunters. The moment the two men saw each other through the glass of the triage bay, the hospital ceased to be a place of healing. Witnesses described the confrontation not as a fight, but as an animalistic slaughter. Neither man spoke. There was no accusation of "who are you?" or "what is going on?" There was only a synchronized, mutual lunging. The Marcus from the house smashed through the glass window, using the jagged shards to lacerate the throat of the Marcus in the bed. The Marcus in the bed, despite his medical state, used his bare fingers to gouge at the eyes of his attacker. By the time local deputies managed to discharge their firearms to separate them, both men were mortally wounded. They died on the linoleum floor, their fingers locked around each other's throats in a grim, identical grip. When the Foundation intercepted the police band transmissions regarding two identical cousins killing each other at the county clinic, a containment team was dispatched within 45 minutes. Class A amnestics were administered to the hospital staff, the sheriff's deputies, and the surviving family members. The bodies of both Marcus Vances were seized and transported to a secure site for autopsy. The autopsies revealed something that disturbed the medical examiners. Both men were the original. There were no synthetic markers, no signs of accelerated cellular mitosis, no genetic drifting. Both possessed the exact same healed clavicle fracture from a high school football game in 1978. Both had the exact same unique pattern of liver spots. The Foundation immediately seized the timberland and established a perimeter around the sinkhole. A 4-man tactical team descended into the dark to locate the remaining 2 spelunkers, David Lee and Sarah Gentry. What they found in the dark was a theater of psychological horror. Deep within what is now known as the upper galleries of SCP-4087, the team discovered the remains of David Lee. He had been beaten to death with a heavy aluminum flashlight. The flashlight used as the murder weapon was found beside his body, engraved with the initials DL 100 yards further down the tunnel. They found a second body of David Lee. This one had been choked to death with a length of climbing webbing. The webbing was tied with a specific, highly non-standard knot that only David Lee used due to an old injury to his left index finger. The 2 versions of David had found each other in the dark, and they had hunted each other through the stone corridors until both succumbed to their mutual rage. The only survivor of the original expedition was Sarah Gentry. The tactical team located her hiding in a narrow crevice, wedged so tightly into the rock that her hips were bruised and dislocated. She had turned off her headlamp to save the battery, sitting in the absolute, crushing blackness of the cave for nearly 3 days. When the team pulled her out, she wasn't crying. She was whispering, a single sentence, repeated over and over until her voice was nothing but a bloody rasp. "I can hear her breathing in my bag. I can hear her breathing in my bag." Beside Sarah was her expedition pack. Inside the pack was nothing but standard survival rations, a map, and a secondary headlamp. But when the researchers later analyzed the audio logs from her helmet-mounted camera, which had remained active until its battery died 40 hours into her ordeal, they heard something chilling. For the last 12 hours of the recording, through the static and the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing, there is another sound. A second voice, coming from somewhere just around the bend of the tunnel. It is Sarah's voice, using the exact same cadence, the exact same words, speaking in perfect, terrifying unison with her. The voice on the recording said, "I know you're in there, Sarah. I know what we're thinking. We're thinking about how cold it is. We're thinking about how much we want to see the sun. Let me out, Sarah. There's only room for one of us in the car ride home." Sarah Gentry was administered maximum doses of Class A amnestics, but the psychological trauma had carved itself too deeply into her neural pathways. The amnestics erased the memory of the cave, but they could not erase the profound, nameless terror she felt whenever she looked into a mirror or saw her own shadow on the wall. She spent the remainder of her life in a specialized Foundation psychiatric care facility, permanently sedated, residing in a room where every surface was coated in non-reflective matte paint. Act 3. The Archives of Trial and Terror. Once Outpost 92 was fully operational, the Foundation began a structured, highly controlled series of experiments designated as Test Log 4087 Alpha. They needed to determine the limits of the cave's replication capability. They needed to know if the anomaly was a biological phenomenon, a psychological manifestation, or a fundamental distortion of physical matter. The first test was deliberately simple. They needed to strip away human ego, language, and complex psychology to see how basic animal instinct interacted with the reflection chamber. For Test 01, a standard male laboratory rat designated R882 was placed in a ventilated wire cage. The cage was lowered via a mechanized winch into the reflection chamber, coming to rest approximately 2 meters from the edge of the black pool. The rat behaved normally upon entry into the chamber. It exhibited standard exploratory behaviors, sniffing the air, grooming its whiskers, and testing the boundaries of its wire cage. At exactly 12 minutes into the exposure, the black pool began to ripple. The thermal cameras recorded a sudden drop in ambient temperature within the chamber, falling from 12 degrees to just 4 degrees Celsius in less than 90 seconds. The rat immediately ceased all exploratory behavior. It retreated to the rear corner of the cage, its fur standing on end, entering a state of acute catatonia induced by extreme fear. For 47 minutes, nothing happened. The pool rippled with increasing complexity, its surface resembling a television screen tuned to dead channels. Then, at the 47-minute mark, a motion sensor in Tunnel 7, a small, dead-end crawlspace located 60 meters north of the chamber, tripped. From the dark of Tunnel 7, a second rat emerged. It was physically indistinguishable from the original, down to a small, distinct notch in its left ear from a previous laboratory identification tag. This duplicate did not explore the environment. It did not search for food or water. It moved with a terrifying, direct intentionality. It scurried across the uneven limestone floor straight toward the reflection chamber, ignoring the bright halogen lights and the hum of the electronic equipment. The researchers monitored the original rat via the cage camera. The moment the duplicate entered the chamber, the original rat did not exhibit the typical social or defensive vocalizations of its species. It began to slam itself against the wire mesh of its cage with such violence that it fractured its own nasal bone. The duplicate reached the cage. It did not attempt to find an opening or investigate the structure. It began to gnaw at the wire mesh, destroying its own teeth against the metal until its mouth was covered in blood. Dr. Alastair Finch, the lead researcher on the project, ordered the cage door to be opened remotely. The moment the barrier was removed, the two rats did not engage in the typical posturing of territorial rodents. There was no rearing up or tail snapping. They threw themselves into a singular, frantic knot of teeth and claws. They bit at each other's throats. They attempted to disembowel one another with their hind legs. They fought with a level of ferocity that defied biological self-preservation. An animal will typically retreat if it sustains mortal trauma. These subjects did not. After 3 minutes of sustained combat, both rats expired. The original had its jugular vein severed. The duplicate had suffered bilateral skull fractures from being slammed against the stone floor by the original, yet it continued to bite at the original's throat for 30 seconds after its own heart had stopped beating. The post-mortem examination confirmed that both rats possessed identical stomach contents, identical parasite loads, and the exact same pre-existing cellular damage from an experimental drug study conducted 6 months prior. The conclusion was clear. The hostility was not a learned behavior. It was a fundamental property of the replication process itself. The universe, through SCP-4087, could not tolerate the existence of the same identity occupying two sets of coordinates. With the biological baseline established, the research team moved to human testing under Test 07. The subject was D-1843, a 34-year-old male convicted of multiple counts of armed robbery, selected specifically for his high psychological resilience scores. He was equipped with a standard tactical jumpsuit, a helmet camera with an integrated two-way audio feed, and a biometric monitoring vest. His instructions were to descend into the reflection chamber and stand beside the pool for exactly 10 minutes. D-1843 was nervous but compliant. He walked down the final corridor and took his position 2 meters from the black liquid. His radio transmissions were recorded by the observation team. "Doc, it's cold down here," D-1843 said. "And this water, it ain't right. It looks like it's looking back at me, like it's heavy." Dr. Finch replied from the booth, instructing him to maintain his position, look directly into the pool, and report any visual changes. At the 4-minute mark, the subject's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's moving. There's circles in it, like someone threw a rock, but there ain't no rock. And, wait, I see myself, but my reflection, it ain't blinking when I blink. It's just staring at me." At the 10-minute mark, D-1843 was ordered to return to the secondary staging area, a reinforced steel security bunker located 300 meters up the main tunnel. He was placed in a secure holding cell equipped with reinforced plexiglass observation windows. The incubation period for this test lasted exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes. At 22 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, the security cameras in the eastern access shaft recorded the emergence of the duplicate. It stepped out of a narrow fissure that had opened directly behind a high-voltage electrical transformer box. The duplicate was wearing an exact copy of the tactical jumpsuit, including the specific sweat stains under the arms and a small grease mark on the right knee from the transport vehicle. It even possessed a duplicate of the helmet camera and biometric vest, though the electronic components of the duplicate's gear were dead, emitting only a low, rhythmic static. The duplicate did not look around. It did not appear confused by its surroundings. It began to walk at a steady, rhythmic pace toward the security bunker. Security personnel were ordered not to engage with lethal force unless the duplicate breached containment. They wanted to observe the interaction through the plexiglass. The duplicate reached the holding cell. Inside, The original D-1843 stood up from his cot, his face turning pale as he looked through the glass at his own visage. The two men stood separated by 3 inches of reinforced polymer. They looked into each other's eyes. They had the same crooked nose from an old street fight. They had the same small tattoo of a weeping willow on their left jawline. For 30 seconds there was absolute silence. Then the original D-1843 spoke, his voice trembling. "What is this? Who the hell are you?" The duplicate did not look angry. Its expression was one of profound, cold certainty. It pressed its palms flat against the glass, matching the handprint of the original on the other side. It leaned its face close to the polymer, its breath fogging the surface. And then the duplicate spoke. Its voice was identical in pitch, inflection, and accent, but the tone was devoid of any fear. It was the tone of a man correcting a clerical error. It said, "You're not supposed to be the real one." Before the security guards could react, the duplicate step-kicked the reinforced glass window with such immense force that the structural frame of the steel door groaned. It didn't care about the integrity of its own bones. The impact shattered the duplicate's right heel and split the skin over its shin wide open, exposing the white of the bone. The duplicate didn't even flinch. Using its hands, it began to wedge its fingers into the small seam where the plexiglass met the steel frame, tearing at the metal with its bare fingernails until they were ripped completely from his fingers. The original D-1843 retreated to the back wall of the cell, clutching his head in panic, screaming for the guards to shoot it. The duplicate managed to crack the frame, throwing its entire body weight against the weakened structure until it burst into the cell. It ignored the security guards who were striking it with non-lethal stun batons. It threw yourself onto the original D-1843, its bloody, nail-less fingers locking around the original's throat. The room became a chaos of identical limbs, identical screams, and identical blood. Dr. Finch ordered lethal force. The security team discharged 3 rounds from a 12-gauge shotgun into the duplicate's torso, killing it instantly. Yet during the subsequent autopsy, the medical team noted that even in death, the rigor mortis setting into the fingers was so severe that they had to use surgical instruments to cut the tendons of the hands, just to release the grip it had maintained on the original's throat. The original D-1843 survived the encounter, but his psychological stability was permanently destroyed. He refused to look at his own hands, claiming they belonged to the guy from the wall. He attempted to skin his own face with a plastic spoon 3 days later to remove what he called the copy. He was eventually classified as an invalid and transferred to long-term psychiatric containment. The results of the human and animal testing suggested that SCP-4087 was reacting to consciousness or biological complexity. Dr. Finch hypothesized that the anomaly might be a predatory entity that fed on the identity of living things. To test this theory, they decided to remove biology from the equation entirely during Test 15. They selected a safe-class anomalous object kept at Site 19, an antique brass pocket watch manufactured in London in 1842. Its anomalous property was simple but precise. When wound, it did not measure standard time. Instead, its hands moved in direct synchronization with the remaining lifespan of the person holding it, counting down the hours, minutes, and seconds until their biological death. It was a purely mechanical, albeit anomalous, inorganic object. The object was placed on a small, sterile, stainless steel pedestal, lowered into the reflection chamber via a remote crane, and positioned 50 centimeters from the surface of the pool. The pool's reaction to the inorganic object was remarkably fast. Within 19 minutes, the ripples reached a peak frequency. At 22 minutes after exposure, a small, clean opening appeared in the limestone ceiling of the chamber, an opening that did not exist prior to the test. From that opening, a second identical brass pocket watch dropped onto the stone floor with a sharp, metallic clink. A remote robotic rover was deployed to recover both the original object and the duplicate. Both were brought to a secure testing laboratory within Outpost-92 for immediate evaluation. The results were astonishing. The duplicate watch was not a non-anomalous replica. When held by a D-class personnel member whose death date had been previously calculated by the original watch, the duplicate displayed the exact same countdown down to the millisecond. It possessed the same micro-scratching on the brass casing from its recovery in 1954. It had the same internal gear wear. But the hostility protocol of SCP-4087 was not limited to living things. When the original watch and the duplicate watch were moved within 10 meters of each other on the laboratory workbench, they did not engage in physical movement. They were mechanical objects. Instead, the anomaly manifested through their anomalous fields. Both watches began to tick with an unnatural, deafening volume, their internal springs winding themselves tighter and tighter without human intervention. The glass faces of both watches cracked simultaneously under the pressure of the internal mechanisms. Then came the energy surges. The laboratory sensors recorded an intense localized electromagnetic field radiating from both objects. The temperature around the workbenches spiked to over 200 degrees Celsius. The hands of the watches began to spin backward at thousands of revolutions per minute, creating a high-pitched, metallic shriek that blew out the audio pickups on the recording equipment. The electronic components of the laboratory began to fail. The fluorescent lights shattered. At exactly 4 minutes into the proximity test, the original watch catastrophically detonated. Its brass casing ruptured from the inside out, sending shrapnel through the laboratory walls and destroying its internal gear train completely. The moment the original watch was reduced to useless scrap metal, the duplicate watch stopped spinning. It fell silent. Its hands returned to a normal, steady countdown. It had won the conflict. It had established itself as the sole resident of that identity within our reality. Dr. Finch appended a red flag to the file, noting that further testing involving anomalous objects was strictly suspended. If the cave could replicate anomalous fields with perfect fidelity, the Foundation risked creating uncontrollable cascade events if an active Keter class or reality-bending object was ever introduced to the reflection chamber. But it was Test 21 that truly terrified the research team. They sought to answer a basic question: what constitutes an identity? Does the cave need a whole person, or does it merely need a template? They placed a 50-milligram biological tissue sample, a tiny biopsy of dermis and muscle tissue obtained from a contained, non-sentient, regenerative anomalous reptile, inside an open glass Petri dish. The dish was placed on the edge of the black pool via a remote mechanical arm. The research team expected one of two outcomes. Either the pool would ignore the dead tissue sample because it lacked a cohesive consciousness, or it would produce a duplicate 50-milligram piece of flesh. They were wrong. The pool began to ripple with a violent, concussive force that actually splashed droplets of the black liquid onto the limestone banks, the first time the liquid had ever breached its own perimeter. The incubation period was abnormally long, lasting nearly 3 hours and 50 minutes. At the conclusion of the 4th hour, a massive rumble shook the entire outpost. It was not a small crawlspace opening. A structural wall of the primary chamber collapsed outward into a gaping, 5-meter-wide cavernous void that had not previously existed. And from that void stepped a fully formed, 600-kilogram, 3-meter-long adult instance of the anomalous reptilian entity. The cave had not copied the tissue sample. It had used the DNA and the anomalous markers within that tiny tissue sample to reconstruct the entire, complete organism from which the sample had been harvested months prior. The duplicate organism emerged in a state of hyperaggressive mania. It did not hunt for food. It began to tear down the tunnel toward the transport elevator, its biological instinct driving it toward the distant site where its original counterpart was currently housed hundreds of miles away. The instance had to be terminated via heavy ordnance, requiring the deployment of 2 tactical security squads and the consumption of over 400 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. Dr. Finch's notes following this test were written with a trembling hand. This is a critical escalation. SCP-4087 does not require a subject to be present to copy them. It requires a signature, a drop of blood left on a rock, a shed hair in the dirt, a flake of skin floating in the air. If any part of an entity enters that chamber, the cave will build the whole person, and that person will come looking for you. Act 4, Incident Omega. Every automated security system has a point of failure, and that point is almost always human error compounded by systemic exhaustion. By March of 2008, the staff at Outpost 92 had been living under the claustrophobic weight of the Kentucky underground for nearly 2 decades. The weekly identity verification checks, designed to ensure no staff member had been secretly replaced by a duplicate during a cave survey, had created an atmosphere of deep paranoia and mutual distrust. On the night of March 12, 2008, a catastrophic equipment failure occurred in the upper electrical grid of the county. A rogue lightning strike disabled a regional substation, causing a transient voltage surge that bypassed the outpost's secondary surge suppressors. This event is recorded in the archives as Incident 4087 Omega, a major containment break and reality structural failure. For exactly 44 seconds, Outpost 92 lost all primary power. The backup diesel generators kicked in as designed, but during that brief window of darkness, the electronic lockouts on the lower containment vaults experienced a logic reset. At that time, the outpost was temporarily housing 3 distinct anomalous entities that had been routed through the facility during a cross-country transport logistical reorganization. These entities were kept in specialized mobile containment crates in Staging Area B, located roughly 400 meters from the cave entrance. The first was a low-level humanoid anomaly possessing minor kinetic manipulation capabilities and acute telepathic sensitivity. The second was a quadrupedal predatory entity covered in chitinous plates that secreted a highly corrosive acid when stressed. The third was a sapient, localized spatial distortion, resembling an old, weathered wooden grandfather clock that caused anyone within 5 meters to experience temporal deceleration. When the power fluctuated, the magnetic latches on all 3 mobile containment units dropped simultaneously. The entities did not attack each other. According to the recovered internal video logs, which were running on independent battery backups, the 3 entities emerged from their crates and immediately turned their heads toward the lower tunnel leading to the reflection chamber. They did not flee toward the exit elevator. They walked, shuffled, and crawled down into the dark, drawn by an irresistible, anomalous pull that resembled an acoustic tractor beam. By the time the security teams managed to rearm their weapons and descend into the system, the 3 entities had already reached the reflection chamber. They stood in a semicircle around the black pool. The pool was not merely rippling, it was boiling. The security teams arrived too late to prevent the activation. They took up defensive positions at the entrance of the chamber, their weapons trained on the 3 entities. But before the commander could give the order to fire or deploy containment nets, the anomalies began to manifest. The cave did not wait hours this time. The presence of 3 distinct anomalous signatures within the chamber simultaneously appeared to overload the spatial buffers of the system. 3 massive fissures tore open across the walls of the chamber with a sound like artillery fire. From the first fissure stepped the duplicate of the humanoid kinetic anomaly. From the second, the chitinous acid predator. From the third, a secondary instance of the grandfather clock distortion. What followed was not a standard fight. It was a structural failure of local physics. The duplicates did not attack the security personnel. They didn't even acknowledge the presence of the guards who were firing non-lethal gas canisters and flashbang grenades into the room. The duplicates walked directly toward their originals. The telepathic humanoid anomaly began to scream, a high-pitched, agonizing shriek that wasn't heard by the ears, but projected directly into the frontal lobes of everyone within a 1-kilometer radius. The guards dropped to their knees, their noses bleeding from the intense psychic pressure. The two versions of the humanoid met in the center of the room. They didn't strike each other. They embraced. They grabbed each other's shoulders, their fingers sinking into the flesh as if they were trying to merge their bodies back into a single point of matter. The moment their skin made contact, massive reality instability occurred. The thermal sensors failed as the temperature in the room dropped below measurable limits. The gravity within the reflection chamber inverted. The guards found themselves lifted off the stone floor, floating in the air alongside loose equipment, spent shell casings, and rocks that had detached from the ceiling. Then came the spatial distortions. The walls of the chamber began to bend inward, the solid limestone behaving like wet clay. The visual field of the security cameras distorted into a series of geometrically impossible spirals. The room appeared to be expanding and contracting at the same time, like a stone lung gasping for air. From the cracks in the walls, unknown biological structures began to erupt. These were not plants, and they were not animal tissue. They were massive, grayish-white tendrils composed of a substance that resembled fossilized bone and calcified muscle tissue. These structures grew at a rate of several meters per second, wrapping around the floating equipment and sealing off the side tunnels with thick, biological barriers. In the center of the room, where the original and duplicate pairs were in physical contact, a blinding flash of white light erupted, a light that did not cast shadows, but instead erased them. When the light faded, the three original entities and their three duplicates were gone. They had not died. They had not left behind bodies or blood. They had simply vanished from the space-time continuum, leaving behind a vacuum that caused an atmospheric implosion. The air rushed back into the room with a concussive shockwave that shattered the eardrums of every guard present and collapsed the upper 200 meters of the eastern access tunnel. When engineering teams and backup security forces finally cleared the rubble and re-entered the reflection chamber 3 days later, they found a completely transformed environment. The chamber was no longer 12 meters in diameter. The cave system had spontaneously expanded, carving out an additional 400 meters of linear passages that branched off from the main room like the fingers of a skeletal hand. These new tunnels were not formed by water erosion. The walls were perfectly smooth, bearing the same organic throat-like texture that had been observed in the deepest parts of the original system. But the most horrifying discovery lay embedded within the stone itself. As the exploration teams advanced down the newly formed passages with their flashlights, they realized the walls were filled with fossils. Not the fossils of ancient trilobites or prehistoric marine life, typical of Kentucky limestone. These were the fossilized remains of things that had never walked the earth under a natural sun. They found the calcified skeletons of massive, multi-limbed humanoids with elongated skulls and jaw structures that possessed 3 rows of teeth. They found the impressions of strange, non-biological machinery, gears and pistons made of fossilized bone and iron ore that had been crushed by millions of tons of geostatic pressure. Dr. Finch conducted a genetic analysis on a small fragment of bone chipped from one of the embedded humanoid fossils. The results were returned from the laboratory under a maximum secrecy classification. The fossilized DNA was an exact match for an extinct hominid lineage that had vanished from the fossil record over 50,000 years ago, but with a terrifying twist. The genetic markers showed distinct signs of modern medical interventions, including synthetic gene splicing techniques that wouldn't be invented by humanity until the late 20th century. The hypothesis within the research division underwent a radical, permanent shift. The cave was not an engine that created clones. It was a landfill. It was a cross-dimensional junction point where reality was discarding its redundancies. Every time an entity entered the chamber and met its echo, the resulting annihilation event didn't just destroy the subjects, it expanded the cave, drawing in a piece of the alternate reality from which the duplicate had been pulled. Those fossils weren't from our past. They were from the pasts of 1,000 different versions of Earth that had all been digested by the echoing hollow. Act 5, the Mirror Paradox. To truly grasp the existential horror of SCP-4087, one must listen to the long-term observation interviews. When a duplicate is captured before it can destroy its original, and it is held in isolation with no visual contact with its counterpart, its behavior is not that of a monster. It is the behavior of a deeply aggrieved, terrified human being. Consider this transcript from an interview conducted by Dr. Alastair Finch with an instance of a duplicate D-class worker, 3 weeks after its emergence during a routine maintenance test. Dr. Finch begins the log by asking the subject to state his name for the record. The subject responds, his voice frantic and defensive. "Are you kidding me, Alastair? We've known each other for 2 years. I'm Marcus Miller, D1992. I'm the guy who helped you calibrate the remote cameras in Tunnel 4 last October. Why am I in this cell? Why are the guards looking at me like I'm a ghost?" Dr. Finch speaks with a flat, clinical tone. "Marcus, I need you to listen to me carefully. We are conducting an investigation into a spatial anomaly that occurred during your last shift. Do you remember entering the reflection chamber?" "Of course I remember," the subject says. "I was clearing the mineral buildup on the lens of camera B. I stood by the pool. I felt that cold air, the pressure in my ears. I thought I heard someone call my name from the side passage, so I went to look. I walked down the tunnel, got turned around, and then the security guys tackled me, threw a bag over my head, and brought me here." Dr. Finch sighs. "Marcus, the maintenance crew found Marcus Miller in the break room 3 hours before you emerged from Tunnel 4. He never left his station. He has the logbook signed in his own handwriting." The recording captures a nervous laugh from the subject, which quickly cuts off. The sound of him leaning heavily against the metal table is audible over the microphone. "That's a lie. That's a trick. I don't know who you have in the break room, Alastair, but it ain't me. The cave copied them, not me. You hear me? The cave copied them." "How can you be certain of that?" Finch asks. "Because I'm inside my own head," the subject screams. "I remember my mother's kitchen. I remember the smell of the pine trees behind my house in Oregon when I was 6. I remember the scar on my shin from when I fell off the tractor. Look at it. I am real. I am the one who lived through it. That thing you have locked up in the other room. That thing is a skinwalker. It's a fake. It's an imitation. You're talking to the real one, Alastair. You have to believe me. The other version shouldn't exist." "It's wrong. It makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. Like there's a wire in my head pulling me toward him. I need to make it stop." Dr. Finch concludes the interview simply, "Thank you, Marcus. That will be all for today." As the chair scrapes back, the subject can be heard slamming his fists against the table, his voice breaking into a sob as the guards approach. "Don't leave me in here with this. If he's out there, then what am I? If you look at him and you see me, then who am I? Alastair, look at me. I'm the real one." This interview is not unique. It is identical to every interview conducted with every human duplicate ever produced by the cave. They do not have a glitch in their memory. They do not have a sinister agenda. They have a complete, cohesive, and perfectly valid human identity. And that is the core of the mirror paradox. Because the physical and psychological replication is so perfect, the Foundation realized a terrifying vulnerability. How do we know the people leaving the cave at the end of their shift are the same people who went down? If a researcher walks into Tunnel 3 alone to replace a battery pack, and they are gone for an hour, and they return with their logbook completed, how can Site Command be absolutely certain that the researcher didn't encounter their duplicate in the dark, lose the fight, and leave their copy to walk out of the outpost? The duplicate would have the exact same clearance codes. They would know their spouse's name. They would know their children's birthdays. They would perform their duties with the same efficiency. The only difference would be that somewhere, deep in the limestone, a corpse with their face was rotting in a dark crevice. To prevent an invisible infiltration of the facility, all personnel assigned to SCP-4087 must undergo mandatory weekly identity verification procedures. These procedures are complex, degrading, and psychologically exhausting. They involve 3 separate stages. First is the biometric drift test, where personnel are subjected to high-resolution cellular scanning to check for subatomic genetic anomalies. While the physical structure is identical, the Foundation has discovered that duplicates often exhibit a almost imperceptible variance in the radioactive decay rates of the carbon isotopes within their cellular structures, a reflection of the alternate universe from which they were harvested. Second is the memory discrepancy matrix. Subjects are placed under a light hypnotic state and questioned about highly specific, emotionally neutral memories from their early childhood, details that were never recorded in their official files. The researchers compare the responses to a baseline recorded before the employee was assigned to the project. If there is even a single word choice variation or a shift in the emotional resonance of the memory, the subject is immediately detained. Finally, there is the proximity alert. Once a month, employees are brought into a room with a specialized sensory isolation chamber. Inside the chamber is a blind biological sample of their own tissue harvested years prior. If the subject experiences a sudden spike in blood pressure, an acute sense of nausea, or an unexplained surge of homicidal adrenaline when standing near the chamber, it indicates that their body is responding to the proximity of its own genetic echo. If an employee fails any of these tests, they are not given a second chance. They are not allowed to contact their family. They are immediately classified as a duplicate and transferred to a high-security containment wing for permanent, lifelong isolation. As a result of this policy, the turnover rate at Outpost 92 is the highest of any non-Keter facility in the network. The staff do not trust one another. Every morning, when 2 researchers sit across from each other in the cafeteria, drinking their coffee, they are looking at a face that might be an imitation. They are wondering if the person they worked with yesterday is the person they are working with today. We come, finally, to the true nature of the echoing hollow, the hypothesis that keeps the members of Site Command awake at night. For the first decade of containment, the official consensus was that SCP-4087 was a localized matter replicator, a machine or an anomalous field that used the black pool as a medium to construct copies of things out of raw elements. It was an elegant explanation. But after Incident Omega, after the discovery of the fossils, and after the analysis of the isotopic drift in the duplicate cells, Dr. Alastair Finch proposed a different theory, a hypothesis that has since become the dominant framework for the study of the anomaly. The pool does not create clones. It does not make anything at all. The pool is a gravitational and dimensional sinkhole. Imagine the multiverse not as a collection of separate, distant realities, but as a stack of sheets of paper pressed tightly together. Each sheet is a slightly different version of our universe. In most of these universes, you exist. You went to the same school. You married the same person. You took the same job. Now imagine someone drove a needle straight down through the entire stack of paper. That needle is SCP-4087. It is a spatial puncture wound that exists in the exact same coordinates across thousands of parallel dimensions. When you walk into the reflection chamber in our universe, you are standing at the edge of the puncture. Your presence alters the local dimensional pressure. The system tries to stabilize itself. To fix the drop in pressure, the hole acts like a vacuum, reaching into one of those alternate sheets of paper, into an alternate universe where an identical version of you just happened to walk into the cave at that exact same moment. The pool rips that person out of their reality. It drags them through the dark of the stone into our coordinates. This explains the absolute perfection of their memories. This explains why they genuinely believe they are the original. Because they are the original. They are the real version of you from a world that was identical to this one until 5 minutes ago when they were snatched out of their life by a cosmic vacuum cleaner. And this explains the absolute, uncontrollable hatred they feel when they see you. It is not an anomalous curse. It is a response to existential asymmetry. When two versions of the same unique soul occupy the exact same coordinate space in the exact same universe, it creates a localized paradox that causes reality itself to tear at the seams. The duplicates aren't hunting you because they are monsters. They are hunting you because their very selves, their very consciousness, is screaming that you are a parasite that has stolen their spot in the universe. Their reality has been deleted, replaced by yours, and the only way they can reclaim their existence, the only way they can stop the agonizing psychological pull of the paradox, is to clear the board, to eliminate the redundancy. There is an unwritten rule among the guards at Outpost 92. When you are on patrol in the lower galleries, and your flashlight beam catches a movement in a side tunnel, a shadow that moves a fraction of a second too late, or a footprint that matches your boot exactly, you do not go to investigate. You do not call it in over the radio. You turn around, you walk back to the elevator, you look at the floor. Because deep down, every person who works within the echoing hollow knows that the cave is expanding. Every year, it gets a little longer. Every year, new tunnels appear, filled with the bones of people who lost the fight against themselves. And if you look too closely into that black pool in the deep dark of the Kentucky limestone, you might just realize that the person staring back at you isn't a reflection. It's the person who is about to take your place.